All right, here we are, Sunday, August 8th. I'm Dylan Nolan, Liam Ford, of course. I'm making YouTube videos here, doing news videos, many a week, I will say, depending on how many I can pump out. And Liam, you're writing a lot. What you want to tell people what you're doing?
Well, right now, just suffering through the news cycle every week, trying to pump out about 3 or 4 articles a week for a couple of different publications that I work for. Part of the fun of being a ghostwriter, I don't always get to mention who I'm writing for, but definitely staying up to date, and I can still put my own voice to all of the research that I'm doing.
So Liam the ghost, me, not so ghostly, right in front of the camera. The first thing we want to talk about this week is the treasure trove of information that has come out about the internal Antifa communications, as well as some information that's come out about the government of Oregon funding charities, as they might call themselves, 501c3 organizations that directly contributed to violent protest. So you want to take it?
Yeah, so I believe it was Tuesday or Wednesday, whenever the messages originally got leaked. It's over 360,000 messages from almost 150 Antifa, BLM, alt-left extremist chapters all across the country. Obviously, mainly focused in big city chapters. So LA, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, New York. Obviously, a lot of representation from the coast. And it takes time to go through this, and it's been something that's relatively uncovered by anybody in the media. Obviously, nobody expects mainstream media or left-wing media to cover this, but it's kind of been surprising to me that really hasn't gotten any traction from right-wing media either. Most of the work that I've seen done with this information has been independent researchers, writers, bloggers, a lot of people on Substack that seem to be willing to go into and spend the time to go through all of this data. So I'm sure it'll take probably another week or two until we know all that's in it. Obviously, the first major revelation that came out was that the city of Portland had given $130,000 to the PAALF, which is an African American forum, basically in Portland. They've done a lot of work with Rose City Justice, RCJ. And basically how they use this money was to organize protests against police brutality or other local events. But obviously the main one nationally last summer was against police brutality following the death of George Floyd. However, as we saw with this data leak, was that they were deliberately setting up and paying for these protests just as cover for their violent operatives to go in and create mayhem, to attack businesses, to attack cops, to attack the federal courthouse there in Portland. And they're very deliberate about it, and they obviously had communication. And so the money, although is being on the surface given to an organization which had some legitimate standing, was actually just being used to fund and enable Antifa and BLM to conduct the 130-day-long siege of the Portland courthouse that we saw all last summer. So that's obviously problematic. But weirdly enough, this hasn't been addressed by anybody in government. You would think that now that the news has broken, although not hit the mainstream, that there would be some attention given to it. They obviously don't care. So I'm curious to see how many other cities, how many other municipalities, or maybe even state governments have given money in roundabout ways to fund the attack on their own institutions, which will come out. But it's also interesting in light of the attack yesterday in Portland, where a bunch of Black Bloc members attacked the Christian prayer group that was having a ceremony or whatever in the park, and the police stood by and did nothing, which is confusing and concerning, and it causes a lot of problems for those on the right that have this undying loyalty to defending the police, because the police clearly don't have that for them. But it's also not surprising in light of this data that the government that pays for the police to be there, is also paying for the attackers to attack the Christians. So both of those entities are receiving money from the same source. So whenever you take that into account of your analysis of these situations, it's really not that surprising that the police are just standing down. Yeah, that's the main story as of yet out of that data.
And the interesting thing is, you still will have people like Jerry Nadler, who's a Democratic representative of New York, claiming that Antifa doesn't even exist. Or while at the same time, Kamala Harris, when she was on the campaign trail, for some reason thought it would be a good idea to go out and ask for donations to bail out the arsonists, looters, and there were even like known sex offenders that she created a bail fund to get out of jail. And there's evidence that's come up in this vast collection of messages between these Antifa members that show that they have a deep understanding of the military tactics, which they, we can observe them using. But it's very interesting to see from the inside the fact that they perceive themselves as a military organization. If you're not familiar with the turn that most armed conflicts have taken in the 21st century in the post 9/11 world, you can think of military force. If it's a power on power like World War II, it's called a symmetrical conflict, where two big armies will put brigades of tanks against each other and will attempt to deplete one another's air forces and navies. That's called symmetrical conflict. Vietnam was a giant failure for the US because that was really an asymmetrical conflict where a much weaker force attempted to beat a far more powerful force using what's called asymmetrical warfare. And that's when the less powerful force will not engage where it knows it's going to lose. It will be move like water is a term that you hear used, because they will flow in where there is an opportunity, strike, and flow right out. And the U.S. was largely unsuccessful in Vietnam because the commanders were people who were very used to symmetrical warfare from World War II, from Korea, although there was certainly asymmetrical warfare in the Second World War, especially on the island hopping. The point being that this technique, which has kind of become the standard in the post 9/11 world, as many of the coalitions of Western countries headed by the U.S. have done counter-terrorist operations in environments where it is strictly asymmetric, where there is one side that has all of the tools of the military, the most advanced military tools that exist, that being the latest and greatest stealth fighters, bombers, missiles, precision guided, night vision, satellite imagery. Obviously, for a force to have any success against that level of power, they need to be very tactical in when they strike and how they get in and out. And the Taliban, Al Qaeda, ISIS have become masters of this. So many of the militaries of the world have been retooled for asymmetrical warfare. We've then seen a turn now, and this is largely why we're getting out of Afghanistan, as our military sees a great power symmetrical threat on the horizon of China. We're now going to go through a 10 to 20-year process of getting ready to fight another symmetrical war. This is all just to give you the background on what asymmetrical warfare is, so you can appreciate the level of understanding of the position that Antifa is in when I read you this quote that's come out here. We cannot possibly hope to defeat the largest police mobilization in Minnesota history with symmetrical warfare tactics. We must fight them on our terms. The state has nothing but time. We have nothing but numbers. We win by attrition. The thing that's lacking from last year is the variety of roles and participation of people from outside of the leftist milieu. Namely, there needs to be a more tactical approach to this protest instead of just using the aesthetics of militancy, the shield wall, without the actions that back it up. Light mages, ranged attacks, fire mages, barricades. This is a direct quote that came out of that collection of messages that shows you that there is real military organization within these far leftist groups, just as there is within the extremist groups on the far right. Buttressing the idea that they are serious is the fact that they are, in this report, they show these after-action reports, AARs, which is another standard military operating procedure. where you go in after each encounter, you write about what went well, what went poorly, what you would hope to replicate, and what you wouldn't do again. Obviously, that's a bastardization of what the military actually does, but after action reports are completely necessary to have successful military ventures, because it's the official way of writing down what went well and what didn't. They wrote about in one of these after action reports needing specialized roles. They wrote about needing to get ahead of bad jacketing and whitewashing, needing to continue articulating why looting is good, why barricades are good, why throwing stuff at police defensively is good, the need to remind people that be water means we don't stay stuck at one location, but move and flow freely, staying out of reach of the law when we need to, and crashing like waves on them when the opportunity strikes. We cannot possibly hope to defeat the largest police mobilization with symmetrical warfare tactics. And that's what that original quote was pulled from. So it's clear that these groups are serious, and it's now been shown that these groups are getting government funding. This is vindicating a lot of things that have been said by people on the right thus far that have not been corroborated, although have certainly been observed, and people with their fingers on the pulse. I mean, if you tightly follow people like Andy No on Twitter, you'll see evidence of this kind of stuff. But if you've just kind of loosely been paying attention to maybe the protests that you've seen on cable TV, you might forget that this is going on and that this is still boiling beneath the surface, and will certainly rear its head again.
Yeah, so going all the way back, the fact that, Jerry Nadler and other state representatives can continue to deny the existence of an organization which not only has wreaked havoc and $2 billion in damages across the country just in the first month. A lot of people don't know that the study that was conducted to understand how much property damage occurred in the aftermath of the George Floyd riots was that study stopped looking about a month after the death of George Floyd. And obviously, the siege in Portland lasted well into, I think it was September, October. So those numbers are actually a lot higher than that $2 billion total that a lot of people cite. But it's of course absurd that, state representatives with, who, are on committees that have or should be looking into the actions of Antifa and BLM last summer just deny their existence completely, especially because the vice president, as you mentioned, fundraised for them. And Keith Ellison, the Attorney General of Minnesota, where a lot of this mayhem took place, wrote a handbook for them called like the Anarchist Handbook. So it's an amazing game where whenever you have control of the media and you have friends in the media that will not call you out on your lies, that you're able to get away with that. Again, the only reason that we ever heard Jerry Nadler deny the existence of Antifa is because some independent conservative commentators found him and ran into him on the street, and they asked him, and that's when he denied it. He was never asked by the mainstream media. He was never asked by a credentialed journalist. It was just somebody with a YouTube channel, kind of like yourself, who had the platform and found themselves in the opportunity to do that. So the ball has been completely dropped by mainstream media, by the politicians, and the truth is that Antifa does operate, as you mentioned, in a military fashion. They operate in a way that they clearly know they have a clear objective. They have a clear means of achieving that objective. And obviously it doesn't really matter to them how they end up achieving it. It's not, they're not afraid of hurting innocent people, from destroying innocent people's livelihood and jobs or homes. So this really is, an insurgent or terroristic attempt by the alt-left right now to make their power, felt by the mainstream public. So until people start to realize, and until the police force understands, not only in Portland or not only in Minneapolis but across the country, the severity of the threat that Antifa poses, then they're going to continue to be successful. Because of the positive press, they're continue to get fundraising from people who don't know better, whether it's because of people like Kamala Harris, the vice president, or others asking for them to donate to this social justice cause. And they'll continue to get donations from left-leaning governments, like the city of Portland, because if these governments fail to support these righteous, in the eyes of their constituents, righteous organizations, then they'll be voted out of office. So we really have to work to break this narrative that surrounds Antifa and BLM among independents and Democrat supporters, because the truth is that whenever people understand the true ideology of Antifa and understand the tactics that they're employing, a lot of people, even on the left, who are more blue dog Democrat types, don't support this type of political activity in the United States. So the only way that we can really fix this is by bringing more light and shining the light onto the actions of Vice President Kamala Harris, the Portland government, and obviously Antifa as an organization.
Yeah, and as far as shining the light goes, on my channel, I've noticed that these things where I will upload just a video with some light commentary giving explanation of the situation with whether it be Antifa or whatever violent protests are happening in the United States, tend to do really well because there's just a severe undercoverage of that. And when you're a small channel like I am, you need to talk about an issue that is not super saturated, but is something that people are interested in to have any chance of getting picked up by the search. So it's definitely something that I'm committed to. One, because it works, and two, because it works because there's not enough people talking about it. If every major news network was blasting these videos all the time, there would be no bandwidth left for me to jump in there and get any significant traction on those videos. That being said, if you're not somebody who's closely following Andy Knows Twitter or people like him who are dedicated to aggregating the video evidence of the lawlessness on the streets, you're just not going to know. So that's one personal commitment that I have, and it's something that's super easy for me. There are things that I have to do a lot of research on to talk about. That would be like something like the infrastructure bill, which we're going to talk about later in this conversation, where you really need to get your facts straight because it's trillions of dollars being spent, actually not trillions, but $1 trillion being spent, and to figure out where that money's coming from, where it's going, it takes a lot of work. Whereas to say, okay, here's this instance in this city, here's what's happening, go, is something that I can make very easily, and yet is a very important thing to bring awareness to. This dovetails really well with what we were talking about in our last conversation about how there is a growing radicalization on the left and on the right. And this is something that I like to come back to every time I see an opportunity to. You're talking about the coverage of Antifa on left-wing media, or the lack of coverage of Antifa on left-wing media. It's the same as the unwillingness to recognize the groups like the Three Percenters, the Proud Boys, who do similarly violent things on the right. And what it's leading to is the left saying, nah, we don't have our violent thugs that act on the streets, and the right saying, nah, we don't have our violent thugs that act on the streets. And it's mobilizing these forces of people who, for whatever reason, have radicalized to exist on the fringes, where the 47% of Democrats and the 47% of Republicans can both have plausible deniability from the media that they consume, saying, no, we don't have extremists, they have extremists. And as those groups grow, that becomes a greater and greater threat to the integrity of the republic, because both sides are developing these little armies, and they're not really armies, but at the same time, when you're using the tactics of the U.S. military and the militaries around the world on the far left that we're seeing here, and that are employed in very similar ways by the far right militant groups, it's hard to claim that you're anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And this is definitely, to me, very concerning.
Yeah, so I think, obviously it's true, but one of the big differences that I think a lot of people seem to be missing when discussing the alt-right and the alt-left is where institutional support comes in. As we were just talking about, the city of Portland gave $130,000 via money laundering, essentially, to Antifa. Meanwhile, how is the alt-right or people that are labeled alt-right and don't necessarily, ideologically line up alt-right, how are they treated by institutional powers here in the United States? That's kind of a stark difference because, you have people right now who have been in solitary confinement for about 7.5 months from the January 6th events and they're charged with nonviolent crimes. So it's almost unheard of to be charged with a nonviolent crime and held in solitary confinement pre-trial. Almost unheard of. Meanwhile, you've got, people on the left who have, there've been people that have been killed at numbers of these BLM and Antifa protests or events. So the way that people are treated by the institutional powers in the United States, one is funded, the left, one is condemned, really in violation of their constitutional rights to due process and a fair trial in the alt-right. So obviously I'm not defending anything that happened on January 6th. People should not have gone in, they should not have broken windows, and they should not have been disorderly. But the fact remains that people have been held for 7.5 months for nonviolent crimes that would generally just be like, slap on the wrist, community service, ROR, pre-trial, and that's how it's handled all across the country. They're not doing that with people that they can label alt-right and that the media can talk about and condemn publicly 24/7, given the cable news cycle. So that's and that creates a bigger problem with the alt-right, because now you have more people that are seeing this injustice being perpetrated, and that creates more of a reactionary right. And that's also another big difference right now between the alt-right and the alt-left is the alt-right is reactionary. Whether it's the Proud Boys showing up to a planned Antifa event, whether it's the Proud Boys patrolling around DC on January 6th, December 14th, and a couple of other days, and they had planned protests. They were looking for Antifa attacking people to defend, defend the bystanders from. Meanwhile, on the alt-left, you have proactive action. You have people who are going out, they're planning protests, they're using government money to plan those protests, to burn businesses, to attack the federal courthouse. It's resulted in at least 25 deaths. I think there was something around 2,500 casualties of police officers last summer from these events. So obviously way worse in numbers than anything that happened in January 6th. Obviously the charges that these people would be facing in a fair criminal justice system would be way worse than parading on government property, trespassing, interrupting a government proceeding or a government hearing. Those are the type of charges that you see January 6th defendants being charged with and held on solitary confinement for. Meanwhile, there was a guy in Dallas who was beat unconscious outside of his store. There was a guy in Portland who, I'm sure everybody's seen the video where they drag him out of his car, they make him sit on the ground, and then they have somebody come up behind him and just football punt him in the back of his head, and he's unconscious. That's way more graphic than anything that we've really seen out of January 6th. So between the institutional support for the alt-left and the institutional condemnation and really collusion on their part between the Department of Justice, mainstream media, and the politicians to condemn and then overcharge and over-prosecute and essentially hold indefinitely these January 6th defendants, and the fact that the alt-left is proactive and the alt-right is reactive are two really big differences that I don't think necessarily get talked about enough whenever people discuss the similarities and the differences between the two, because one is way more dangerous right now in the United States, and the evidence there is pretty clear.
And I think this extends more than just the extremists. The left is proactive in general, and the right is reactive in general.
100%,
the right is
always
the party
has been.
that's attempting to pull the emergency brake on the train that's about to rip off a cliff, whereas the left is the party that will decide on a policy goal and march towards it at whatever cost. The right,
Yep.
at least in my lifetime, has not had the decisiveness to march towards any goal in that way. And that definitely extends to the extreme groups. The most decisive, intentional thing on the right was the Stop the Steal movement. Obviously, this was not reactive, those people showing up on January 6th. People were proactively showing up to attempt to make a point, as good or poorly intentioned as the people who showed up that day were, and as well-founded or not as their conceptions of voter fraud were. That was an aberration, in that it was people on the right proactively making a point. And I guess Charlottesville is another example of that. That was not a reaction to anything on the left so much as an expression of far right in many instances. I mean, you saw the marching around of the torches. That was certainly indicative of some.
Was forgive me, I don't remember the specifics, but was the protest in Charlottesville in response to the attempt to take down like monuments, or no? I know there was some around that time, but I'm not sure if that's true.
You know, I don't want to get out over my skis and say something that's not true. So
yeah, no, I don't really know either. That's why I was asking. But
yeah, I can't confirm or deny on that one, and that's just, you know, I'm sure a problem that we'll run into a couple times here, as just two guys without producers or whatever to be able to look things up and pipe them into our ears. You know, maybe someday we'll get to that level, but
yeah, we need a teleprompter up here. We need to have, a research team in the back, but until we get there,
the Tucker Carlson live cable news setup. So to answer your question, I don't know, and without doing, some Googling, I wouldn't be able to tell you that. However, that was certainly, when you see like these groups driving in with a lot of people coming in from out of state, that kind of indicates it's more of a proactive. I know the Unite the Right, like they had brought in speakers. I remember Michael Malice in his book, The New Right, talked about going to speak at that event and how the feeling in the air was completely different than any of these events that he had spoken to. And he's an anarchist. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He lives in New York. I think he's moving to Austin. He had written this book, The New Right, and he talks about how he's been with the same group of people at different events, but how it felt completely different. And I believe he's Jewish, and he said he felt like not at all comfortable being there. So it was definitely planned. I don't know if it was planned in response to monument removal, but I think it was, even if it was definitely an event that was planned months in advance, where they were flying in, speakers.
Right.
So I think we've kind of made our way through that topic, and obviously we will probably continue to talk about this as whatever the next thing that kicks up social unrest happens, and we see that bloom again throughout the country. I'm not sure what that will be. Hopefully not another horrific police brutality case, although I fear that could happen at any time. And I think that these things happen. It's just a question of when does the media kind of get the snowball rolling that blows it up into a huge national story. Right. I have this inclination, this sneaking feeling. I follow this Instagram account called Police the Police, and it's just videos of cops doing cop stuff, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But there was this video last week that came out of a cop giving this guy standing in the middle of the street, just knocks him out. One punch, walks up to him, no attempt to, put your hands up, anything, just. And I think it was a black cop to a black guy, like right in the face, knocks him out cold, bangs his head right off the concrete. It's like that could have been a George Floyd moment if that guy had whacked his head the wrong way and died. And if that cop wasn't black. And we're on, that could happen at any time. But we will continue, I'm sure, to talk about this when the next George Floyd happens. And we see civil unrest breaking out throughout the country. There was a couple smaller stories I'd like to touch on before we move into the infrastructure deal, which, as we speak, it is Sunday. I'm refreshing cspan.org right now to see. They are still, they're not in the chambers right now. So they're working on getting that bill through the Senate, but it's all but through at this point, at which time they will send it to the House of Representatives. And it will probably not get voted on over there until after the September recess. However, before we talk about that, there's a couple things. United Kingdom's Transport Secretary has told the BBC that vaccine passports will be required forevermore and that young people will not be allowed to leave the country without them. People on the right who are speculating when these vaccine... First of all, there was a denial that vaccine passports were going to happen. That was the line for a number of
A
months.
huge denial. Everybody said it was a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, all right. You're Alex Jones. You're a conspiracy theorist if you say vaccine passports are going to happen. And then there was this switch, I don't know, was it 2 months ago now, when leaders all throughout the EU came forward with vaccine passports and said, yeah, JK, just like you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. Vaccine passports were all of a sudden a thing. And now this is just the nail being driven into the coffin. Sorry, my video went out there, but these vaccine passports are now permanent. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, I'm sure it's not surprising to you.
No, I mean, yeah, I kind of saw this coming from a mile away. I was one of the people that a new requirement to participate in society. Everybody's like, no, it's not. You're a conspiracy theorist. Well, here we are. Okay. And obviously, I can't give all of the contextual information due to our friendly overlords at YouTube. But essentially, the reason that these statements are coming forward is because the percentage of young people who are unvaccinated is higher. Well, some might say that it's higher than the proposed budget at Pfizer and Moderna would like. Other people might say that there's a public health need for young people to get vaccinated. I don't think that there's a whole lot of evidence for the second point, given the case fatality rate and the infection rate among young people. Delta variant, Lambda variant, Delta plus variant, whichever variant we're talking about, it doesn't really matter. The data has been pretty stable. Cases are rising pretty much across the country, across the globe, regardless of vaccination rate, and also regardless of vaccination rate, deaths aren't rising. So for whatever reason, that we'll probably need to wait to see exactly how this plays out for the next week or so. But as cases have risen, we would expect to see an increase in the number of deaths, especially given the media coverage of it. We haven't, and I think that they call it vaccine hesitancy, which is interesting. But there's no need for young people to get vaccinated, according to the data, for their own health. It doesn't necessarily make them any safer, especially with the new report from the CDC saying that the vaccinated are spreading the disease just as easily as the unvaccinated. So why is the transport minister saying this? Because there's been an acceptance among the leaders globally that vaccination rate equals safety, and the messaging to the public has been that once we reach a certain threshold of vaccinated population, then life will go back to normal. I leave it to people to decide whether or not you should trust what the institutions say, whether or not they've held up, quote unquote, their end of the deal on previous promises regarding getting back to normal. It's another carrot before they try the stick, I would say.
And you've definitely seen the carrot and stick saying the quiet part out loud from many of the leaders on the left, people who are a little more forward in their willingness to talk about COVID policy have frequently said in the last couple of weeks, listen, we've tried playing nice, now let's play hardball.
Right.
And this is less playing hardball and more just checkmate. I mean, we have you in check. There's nowhere for you to go. What are the people of the UK going to do at this point?
Yeah.
The next story I'd like to talk about before we get to the infrastructure bill is the Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley are confirmed to be paying for at least 2 full hotels to house illegal immigrants that the Biden administration has released. You had mentioned before we started recording that religious charities are pretty much becoming tax-free political donation hubs. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, we've seen a politicization of every aspect of American life, sports, religion, obviously, and this goes back to Dennis Prager's point that the left tends to corrupt everything it touches. So for people, whenever they give to the Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley, they know what their money is, where their money is going, and so it's a way for them to enact political policies or to achieve political ends via what was not considered legally a political donation or a political act. And obviously, this is a huge problem. The crisis on the southern border is a huge problem that the Biden administration and the person in charge, Kamala Harris, has been completely silent on, completely dropped the ball on. And we saw, I think it was 2 days ago, from the Department of Homeland Security, 864 unattended migrant minors were apprehended in 1 day. That's just the ones that were caught. That's just 1 day. How are we planning as a country to deal with that? The Biden administration obviously can't handle them. That's why they're releasing people into the country that have nowhere to go. They have no means of supporting themselves. There's a good chance that they don't speak English. And it's another thing or misconception that a lot of people have is that these are just, people coming from Mexico or Venezuela or other countries. It's not. According to the data from the Department of Homeland Security and ICE, they've apprehended people from over 100 countries on the southern border. So people see this as an open door. It's not just people who are fleeing one specific bad situation. It's just an open door into the country. And we really have no idea who's coming in, how many, or what we're going to do whenever they get here. And, it's not to say that, people shouldn't come. That's not the argument from people on the right. The question that we're asking is, how are we processing them? How are we making sure that they can support themselves? Because the reason that the Rio Grande charity has to support them right now is because they can't provide for themselves. So what happens if they don't wind up in that situation? What happens to all of the people who, can't find a bed at one of these two hotels? There's a lot of questions surrounding the crisis at the southern border that people are just ignoring. And until the Biden administration, steps up and does its job and secures the southern border and figures out how to process everybody that's down there right now, it's just going to continue to grow, and the crisis is going to compound. So we'll see if that gets better. I don't see much hope in it. The only glimmer of hope that I've seen recently has been governors like Kristi Noem and Ron DeSantis pledging to send National Guard forces to Texas to help out Greg Abbott secure the border. But it's been a ball that has been completely dropped by the Biden administration.
Yeah, and sending National Guard, while it's like, okay, you got to plug the gap somehow. It's like sticking chewing gum in the dam. People who choose to serve in the National Guard are all people who have regular jobs in the civilian world, and they choose to serve in the National Guard so that if there's an emergency in their state, weather emergency, whatever, giant power outage, they want to be the people who step in, fill the gap. Or if our country needs them in a time of war, whether that be in the Middle East or if there's, God forbid, some giant war, it really helps to have these thousands of soldiers trained and to have that infrastructure already laid out so that in a time of war we can quickly mobilize. That being said, these people didn't sign up to leave their job as whatever, a manager at a retail store or as a lawyer or as a doctor, a dentist, whatever all these people do, a mechanic, to go work on the southern border. That's something that a properly funded and properly legislatively enabled immigrations force should do. Or if the states are going to step up and do this, they need to create their own versions of Border Patrol to fill that gap. It just really stinks for those everyday Americans who are in the National Guard, who are getting called to do what is really not their job.
It's 100% not their job. It's the job of the federal authorities. But again,
but these are
they
the
have
forces
been
that the
inhumane
governors
about it.
have at their disposal. So, you know, that's what they're choosing to use when that's the only
It's
tool in
really
your
their only
toolbox. That's
option
what you're
right
going to
now. Yeah.
do. It's interesting to see these failures at the federal level and to kind of wonder, what are these going to lead to in terms of states taking back some power? It's like, if the federal government's not going to do the job that we delegated it to do, which, by the way, borders are something that the federal government has had control over forever. It's not like one of these things that they've stolen from the states in the last century.
It's one of their only
actual constitutionally
actual obligations.
right.
Yes.
Like, they got to like do the mail and do the border, and then everything else
Yep.
they've just like stolen from the states since the inception of the Union.
Yep.
But their failure on that basic constitutional mandate will probably lead to some very interesting states' rights cases, as the constitutionality of sending troops to the border, especially the ones that were privately funded. Which state were those coming out of? Do you know? I don't have this on the
I
top of
don't
my head.
know.
But one of the
I don't
governors
know.
received a large donation from a private source that she used to fund the National Guard going to the border. Not clear if that's even legal, but that will lead to some very interesting states' rights legal fights in the future.
Well, if we're going to open the door into how private money affects the operation of government, we have a big conversation to be had on the $350 million that Mark Zuckerberg gave to different municipalities around the country and states around the country for get out the vote efforts. So that would be an interesting conversation to have, especially if people who would not like to see the border secured, if they start to open the legal door to that type of constitutional law question. But yeah.
And swinging back to COVID a little bit here, and actually a website that we will be talking about in the infrastructure bill section, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation holds close to $2 billion in J&J stock and is also one of the main financial backers of factcheck.org, which has targeted vaccine hesitancy. Obviously, the conflict of interest here shows you why these websites like PolitiFact, Snopes, factcheck.org, you need to fact check the fact check frequently.
Right. Well, it's interesting because, a lot of people read the headlines and they don't get the full story, but this is one of those stories where you can read the headline and the full story. There's not a whole lot of more relevant information. There is not a bigger conflict of interest. And obviously, they try and downplay it and they have their PR people working on it. But the fact remains that they have 2 billion reasons why they would want to see Johnson & Johnson stock improve. And how is, Moderna has seen their evaluation rise $100 million just in the last quarter. So to say there's no financial reason for them to be exerting power over factchecker.org is absurd. And we also see, the same issue kind of presents itself time and time again. Fact checkers are not unbiased. They have never been unbiased. And so for Facebook and for now the government, the executive branch of the government, to be working with Facebook and fact checkers to try and take quote unquote misinformation offline is extremely problematic. It's, I would say it violates free speech. There's an interesting legal question there of whether or not you can, make that case and win in the court of law. But it's certainly un-American in principle. The idea that because some institution or political power has deemed what you have or what you want to say as misinformation, and therefore you can't say it and your account can be deleted, is very much not what the founders intended. And I think that's pretty clear, at least in principle, even regardless of how the legal fights turn out. But yeah, it's definitely problematic.
Awesome. With that wrapped up, I think we should now turn to the infrastructure bill. It's probably the most important thing to have come through the legislature in the Biden administration. Obviously, there was massive COVID relief. That's probably more important, but it will rank up there in his legislative achievements of his administration, most certainly. So I want to start by going through CNN Politics has an article that talks about what the bill, what is in the bill, and then there's a lot of things that are also in the bill that are not in the CNN Politics article. But I think that me running through the CNN Politics will give people who haven't followed this very closely, because obviously it's pretty complicated as to what's in here, a good way to wrap their head around what's going on in this bill. Then we'll move to some of the less pronounced things in the bill that might have slipped by. And then we can talk about some of the political ramifications of this bill, and that might be where we speculate as to what the implications of this will be going forward. So first thing, $110 billion are going to roads, bridges, and other major infrastructure projects. These are the things that you probably would think of as infrastructure. If I said the word infrastructure, you're probably picturing a road or a bridge in your head. So $40
So it's
billion
about 10% of the bill.
Correct. 10% is going towards that. $40 billion for bridge repair, replacement, rehabilitation. This is totally stuff that I think people of both parties can get behind. I like driving on roads
Especially
that
for
work.
people in South Carolina.
Jesus, man, it's like driving on the moon around here. Like, it is shocking.
Yeah, you
to
might
me.
need to see.
You know, and maybe that's why Lindsey Graham supports this bill, although he doesn't spend that much time here, so I don't know if it bothers him too much. The next thing is for transit and rail. The package has $39 billion to modernize public transit. This is to make bus stations, train stations available to more people. And here's where it starts getting a little controversial, in that most of these funds for new vehicles are going towards zero emission and electric vehicles. The question is this the best way to proceed as far as vehicles for the future? And the reason is not that gas vehicles are inherently better. It's just that it's not clear whether these vehicles are actually better for the environment, because one, to produce the batteries that goes into most electric vehicles requires a lot of energy itself. It also requires pulling a lot of natural resources out of the earth that is not... You getting that audio issue coming through?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Well, hopefully that's not coming onto the recording. All right. The second part of that problem is that most of the power in the United States that we use is coming from non-green sources. And as somebody who, I'm definitely not for trashing the environment. I'll say that. I can acknowledge the fact that the earth has gotten warmer. I can acknowledge the fact that the ocean is getting more acidic. I can acknowledge the fact that the ocean is getting warmer. These things are just observably true. It's not like politically manipulated to stick a thermometer in the same part of the ocean and just give a reading all the time. It's not politically motivated to stick a thermometer in a certain city and give you the temperature readings. We're definitely warming up. Now, the policy that we choose to pursue to ameliorate that issue, and to the extent to which it is an issue, are completely different stories as to how much agreement I have with people on the left. To me, it seems like nuclear power is a clear, good solution to this, and I don't really understand why that's not something that's being pursued on a bipartisan basis as a way to phase out fossil fuels and make it so using electric vehicles is actually good for the environment. I mean, if you're filling your electric car up with power that's coming from a coal plant or coming from natural gas, you're still using fossil fuels.
Yeah, it's definitely not great for the environment currently. I'll tell you, it is great for Nancy Pelosi's husband's stock portfolio, given the huge call option he bought of Tesla. So Whether or not that plays into that decision, I don't know, but I'll tell you that that's probably better for her net worth than it is for the environment. But that's probably safe.
There's certainly special interests involved, but I'd like to keep moving through the main text of the bill here. There's 66 billion being invested in passenger and freight rail. I'm not, knowledgeable enough about the current state of our passenger and freight rail to know whether this is a good thing. So I'm just going to move on, and hopefully, if you're listening to this, you might be educated enough to know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Putting 65 billion towards improving the broadband of this country. Now, this is something as a conservative that on one hand, I'm like, this should be done with the private sector improving it where it thinks it should be improved. But on the other hand, I just got finished with an FDR biography, and the electrification of rural America was undoubtedly something that allowed us to boom as a country following the Second World War. And actually, as conservatives mainly live in rural areas, this could be something that benefits a lot of conservatives. So you can decide whether, as somebody who believes in the free market, deciding where funds should be allocated, this is something you oppose. But you could also say that this is something that aid from the federal government will improve the lives of a lot of regular American people and might actually allow us to de-urbanize, in that it will allow people to work from home in parts of the country which it would previously be unrealistic to do that from, and will allow people who are living in parts of the country right now that are mainly agrarian to connect to the information economy and make big city salaries living out in other parts of the country. So this is something, once again, that you can really choose how to feel about, but it's something that they're funding here. The next major items with 17 billion is airports, ports, waterways. 17 billion in port, 25 billion in airports. This once again is something that the majority of the things that we get from overseas are coming in through ports. We need to have functioning ports for our economy to work. We are a country that imports and exports a lot. This seems like money well spent to me. Power and water systems. This is now getting to the area somewhat outside of traditional infrastructure by far. 73 billion to rebuild our electric grid, adding thousands of miles of new power lines and expanding renewable energy. 55 billion for water infrastructure, replacing lead service lines and pipes so that communities can have access to clean drinking water. Replacing lead pipes definitely sounds good to me.
Probably a good thing, especially after Flint.
And after those problems are still a thing in that community all these years later.
Mm-hmm.
21 billion for Superfund and brownfield sites. If you don't know what Superfund sites are, they're basically areas that are so chemically damaged from industrial use that the federal government goes in and declares that they're like not safe for people to be near at all. And so this is a fund to go in and try to decontaminate some of those areas so that they're safe for people to live around.
It.
And even so that the chemicals don't seep into like people's drinking water and give people cancer that have the poor fortune of living near one of these areas. So how is Congress paying for this? This is a $1.2 trillion bill. About half of that money was previously approved for in the response to COVID-19. A lot of that money, for example, 26 states stopped using unemployment funds that have been already allocated by the federal government early. So they're going to dip into some of that money to fund this. So that's about half of it. And the other half that is not funded, according to, and this is actually where you go to factcheck.org that was mentioned earlier in the show, Budget Watchdog Group, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget writes, the framework claims 491 billion of offsets with an additional 56 billion in savings from dynamic scoring to pay for the bill. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget writes in a post on its website, however, many of these pay-fors count savings that have already occurred. We estimate the actual offsets will roughly total 200 billion before dynamic scoring. So basically, the government pays for, which is a very interesting thing. They pay for this with future savings. I mean, if you're budgeting for, say a restaurant, I'm not going to take on my paycheck future savings. You have to pay for, even if it's going to generate returns for the restaurant in the future, you actually have to outlay cash to make any of these things happen. So it's a very non-intuitive way and a very sneaky way of saying, all these senators get to come out and say, this is paid for. Well, $500 billion, which is no small amount of money, is basically, we think that we're going to get this in returns. And even if that number is, and what this Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget says is that the amount of money that's going to come back is less than is expected. Even if they get everything they say they're going to get, that's a really sneaky way of going out and saying, basically we're going to borrow money, but we're going to get it back. Say you're going to fund it with the debt, but don't say it's paid for.
Right. The government has well, a storied history, let's put it that way, of manipulating numbers to make it look financially better than it is in reality. I mean, how do you think we end up in, $20+ trillion of debt? We obviously don't have people who are dedicated to balancing a checkbook or are even really concerned about it. But yeah, it's all a political game so that they can go back and tell people on the campaign trail that, they didn't have to spend any extra money or anything like that. It's all absurd, of course, because government always ends up running a deficit and always ends up wasting a bunch of its money, which is, I agree with a lot of the things that are in the bill that you listed, that, things that need to be done. But it's also true that it's not going to be done efficiently by the government. Nothing's ever been done efficiently by the government. So as a small government conservative, it is kind of a difficult pill to swallow that we're going to have to see all of this money get, well, essentially wasted in their attempts to fix real problems. But that's kind of the government's MO is, they can identify a real problem, but they can't fix it. And then they run and campaign on that same problem for the next 30 years. But I digress. So it's all political fun and games because they want to be able to tell their constituents that they didn't have to increase taxes or raise, the debt. But the truth is that they're going to have a deficit here between what they get back and then what they end up having to outlay, and that'll end up, going into the already huge mountain of debt that we have as a country. So it's just dishonest politicians, but I mean, who's really surprised by that?
And, your claims might have sounded a little bit ridiculous as to saying that this is all going to be wasted, but there's pretty clear evidence that even before the first shovel hits the dirt on this infrastructure package, that there is money that's going to ridiculous places. For example, the infrastructure package, and this is coming from a Daily Wire story that came out on the 3rd, gives $1 billion to a commission led by Virginia Governor Ralph Northam's wife and Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia's wife. So you can see, like, this is clearly a large amount of money being doled out to the wives of two high-powered Democrat politicians or pet organization.
Not only are they two, the wives of two important people in politics, but Joe Manchin is largely considered the swing vote in the Senate right now. So it's a little bit of a conflict for the Senate to essentially try and buy him off by offering his wife's company such a huge amount of money. That was the first thing that I thought whenever I read that story, because there's been so much focus on Joe Manchin whenever it comes to swinging him either way. He obviously said he wouldn't vote to get rid of the filibuster, and he's been pretty much targeted by both sides as the swing vote needed by the left to avoid having to use Kamala Harris as the tiebreaker, and obviously people on the right to win in any case.
Yeah, and that's not the only thing in there that is concerning. One thing that really freaks me out is that the infrastructure bill has language in there that would force all new cars to have both passive monitoring and breathalyzers inside of the vehicles. The $1.2 trillion, 2,700 page bill, and this is coming out of another Daily Wire story that came out on the 5th, would, quote, passively monitor the performance of a driver of a motor vehicle to accurately identify whether that driver may be impaired and prevent or limit motor vehicle operation if an impairment is detected. Alternatively, it could passively and accurately detect whether the blood alcohol concentration of a driver exceeds the legal limit, then prevent or limit motor vehicle operation if a BAC is above the legal limit is detected. Now, this is all well and nobody likes people dying because drunk, inconsiderate losers think that they are above having any consideration for other human beings when they get sloshed and then hop in their cars. That being said, this is a huge problem because you're one step away once you start putting all these passive technologies in cars that are federally mandated from having. Okay, you have to have a passenger-facing car or camera in every car, and we're going to run that through facial recognition. And if you have an outstanding warrant, the police will be called to your location. It's a slippery slope where you take one of these bites out of liberty, and all of a sudden you start taking more and more. Or to give another example that falls in the same principle of, well, we've allowed this, so why not allow a tax credit for safe drivers, where we monitor how you drive, and if you're driving well, we will give you less, and if you're driving poorly, you're going to pay more in your taxes. Or a tax that you pay by the mile, because of course this technology would give federal tax authorities the ability to know exactly where you're driving all the time. Is that really information that we want to be giving to the federal government? I don't think any conservative would ever say yes to that. And to me, if I was a conservative in the Senate, that alone would be enough of a reason to not vote for this infrastructure bill. I would 100% hold up the passage of this bill until that was not in it. Yet there are many conservatives who are okay going along with that.
Right. And I think there were 17 Republicans that ended up voting for it. And obviously Republicans, definitely not conservatives, especially in the Senate. But this kind of speaks to a larger point that I think is really interesting, and has really become very common, especially in younger generations, is that people are unable to identify trade-offs. You obviously have the old adage, you can't have your cake and eat it too. A lot of people don't realize that because it's a fact of life. You're going to have repercussions from every decision, and you're going to find it impossible to have everything you want in life generally. And this goes double basically when dealing with government. And we've seen this with COVID. We've seen it with obviously the infrastructure bill. It's impossible for people to understand the negative ramifications of decisions that they want, especially whenever those decisions are being made by the government. So is it good to have, fewer drunk drivers? Yes, that's good. Is it worth the trade-off? Well, a lot of people don't even see that a trade-off is happening. They don't see the infringement of liberties and individual privacy that happens whenever you give the government the authority to monitor, record, listen, and for all we know, control your car all the time, 24/7. The power that gives to government is not trivial, and people treat it or just ignore it, or if they acknowledge it at all, they treat it as necessary for a greater good. And that's concerning whenever it comes to the political dialogue in America, especially in younger generations. You saw the same thing with mask mandates and vaccine passports and just the way that the government has handled the COVID pandemic as a whole. But the fact is that people need to get used to viewing the decisions of government as having both good and bad consequences. because until we stop this kind of idealization of government, people are going to continue to be okay with, vaccine passports and the government having the ability to monitor passengers and drivers and driving techniques and how many miles you travel in a day. Nobody's going to have a problem with that. But the truth is that it is problematic, because it is something that you would see in a Black Mirror episode or the social credit system of communist China, but it's not something that you would think that you would be seeing here in the United States. And it's time people start to realize that, in my opinion, at least anyway.
And the infrastructure bill, one of the safe havens for people on the right, for people who want to have some sort of existence outside of the current monetary scheme, outside the current internet infrastructure, has been blockchain and cryptocurrencies. And as everybody in that world expected, the federal government is attempting to get its tentacles around that industry, and somehow this is infrastructure is and this is Daily Wire, same author, August 4th. Senate infrastructure bill would expand cryptocurrency tax reporting. A provision of the bill, which is supported by Kristen Sinema, Arizona, Romney, Utah, defines digital asset as any digital representation of value which is recorded on a cryptographically secured distributed ledger or similar technology. The Daily Wire then quotes the New York Times saying the aim is to bring more transparency to an opaque sector, which critics argue is a haven for money laundering and tax evasion. But the provision also underscores the realization in Washington that the $2 trillion industry is here to stay and offers a new opportunity to generate federal tax revenue. By strengthening tax enforcement on such digital assets, the federal government could raise $28 billion over a decade, according to an estimate by the Joint Committee on Taxation, which analyzed the plan. While that would be just a small fraction of the $550 billion that lawmakers have proposed in a new federal spending on infrastructure, it is among the fresh sources of revenue included in the plan. The distributed ledger technology is one of the best things for free speech, because it allows a website like Odyssey, the alternative video hosting website, which I plan on hosting all of my content on once I reach the 300 subscriber threshold that you need to have your YouTube page automatically sync to Odyssey, uses distributed ledger technology so that their backend is not located on any one individual server. It's located on thousands of computers spread throughout the country and the world. This makes it much, much harder for a nefarious actor to take their platform down. And that scares the crap out of people who want to have total control over the internet. And once you have payment processors that operate in this way, once you have video hosts that operate in this way, it means that completely blackballing somebody from the internet, short of extreme measures which we don't know of right now, is impossible. The same goes for the cryptocurrencies. If you, like many people right now, see the spending that's being done by the United States government and the devaluation of the currency, which has been reflected in real inflation right now, and see the fact that eventually the ticking time bomb is going to blow up, or at least believe that that's the case, you are you're heavily incentivized to look for an alternative. And while hard assets like gold are certainly something that has stood the test of time as a way to hedge against inflation, cryptocurrency has the added protection of being an easy replacement for the dollar as something that you can do transactions in. I mean, it would certainly be difficult to retool the economy to accept cryptocurrencies instead of US dollars. That being said, to use something like a Venmo, a PayPal, a Square, and payment processors that are already being used would not be very difficult. So it's a great hedge against the complete financial ruin of the world should the US dollar go belly up, if our government is stupid enough to allow it to do so. which I don't see who is in our government that's going to prevent that from happening at some point in our lifetimes, because
Right.
most of the people that are running our government are people that are septuagenarians or octogenarians who don't really care. They will be dead before this matters. But people like us who have to think about living for another 40, 50, 60 years are eventually going to have to deal with the problems that are being created right now. And this infrastructure bill is an example of that, through not fully funding this. And as a conservative who doesn't like taxes, I would be so much happier if they funded this by increasing taxes right now, just so that this is not one more thing added to the credit card bill. But this infrastructure bill, funnily enough, cracks down on the people who are trying to hedge themselves against the bad influences on our economy of bills like this.
Right.
And so now that we've moved through some of the things that we agree with on the infrastructure bill, and some of the things that we disagree with on the infrastructure bill, I think it's time to talk politics on this bill, because that's probably one of the most interesting, juicy things to me. New York Times, for GOP, infrastructure bill is a chance to inch away from Trump. If you haven't caught it, Donald Trump has been screaming from the hilltops, denouncing this infrastructure bill. If you don't know, Donald Trump and the Senate minority leader Mitch McConnell have been seriously going at it for the last couple of months. And this has shown which Republican senators are looking for that opportunity to distance themselves from the Trump agenda, and which of the Republican senators are sticking with America First, sticking with MAGA, sticking with Trump, and not voting for this bill.
So yeah, we had 17 vote for it, obviously. As far as the political fallout from this, I think that it's pretty clear among the conservative circles, with the way that Fox News and others have covered the senators that supported this bill. I think it's pretty clear that people who voted for it are going to have to answer for it. Now, it's clear that the infrastructure in the country needs to work. Nobody's questioning the need for infrastructure spending or the fact that it's a necessary topic for the legislature to address. The issue that conservatives, especially grassroots conservatives, seem to be having with the bill is the monitoring aspect of the bill, whether it's putting cameras in cars or whether it's the special interest parties getting cash up front from this infrastructure bill. There are reasons, even if a bill is addressing a problem that needs to be addressed, it does not mean that whatever version of the bill you're presented with, you should vote to pass. There's a line in the sand that a lot of Republican senators seem to be unaware of. And obviously their supporters are a little bit more in tune with the financial problems that our country seems to be headed in. We've already spent, over $10 trillion because of COVID over the last year and a half. So we have real financial problems as a country that we have to answer for, and more special interest spending, more government bureaucracy, and more government censorship or surveillance capabilities being, put into an infrastructure bill to address a real problem in the country is insulting to Americans. And it seems like at some point they've had it. So we'll see. I'm not sure that in 6 years, people are going to remember that their senator voted for this bill. I don't think that the memory of the American voter is that long. And the data and history pretty much prove me right on that one. But for people who are up for election in 22, and I don't know how many of the 17 are, this could be a real problem for them, because people like Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity probably will bring this up again before the election, because it is so recent. So, especially if they're having a primary opponent, and those primaries are going to be happening within a year, it it could be a problem for some of the people that voted for it. But I think overall, it needs to be a problem, because if the American people aren't able to hold their elected representatives accountable for action that they have taken, even if they were 4 years, previous, then it's going to be really easy for politicians to continue to pass policies and pass bills that do not benefit in any way the American public. And that's what this bill does. This bill, although it tries to address a real problem, has so much baggage attached to it that it becomes counterproductive and ends up creating bigger problems than it's trying to solve. And that's just leaving aside the whole funding aspect of it, which is going to be another problem down the road.
And this is coming on the heels of 4 years of the Trump administration, where Donald Trump was more than willing to spend money. I mean, the guy was spending money like it was going out of style. He was constantly harassing Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, to do the least conservative policy of lowering interest rates to get the stock market going up, because Donald Trump is a huge fan of the stock market going up. So it's not like Donald Trump was not trying to get this passed in his 4 years in office, and got politically stomped on by all of the Democrats in the legislature, such that he couldn't get this done. And it's a real spit in the eye of him and of his voters when, as soon as he's out of office, all of these Republicans turn around and work to give Joe Biden a major bipartisan win, after a lot of these Republican senators just got done campaigning hard against why Joe Biden should not be in the White House.
Right. Yeah, and we say bipartisan. It seems to denote support or benefit for both parties. But we need to be clear that it's bipartisan in the sense that everybody in Washington likes this bill, and it's good for everybody in Washington. It's good for Joe Manchin's wife, and it's good for Ralph Northam's wife. But as far as everyday Americans, this is not a good bill, regardless of which party they're on, and regardless of whether or not they support the bill. The bill is not good for the American way of life. So bipartisan does not necessarily mean good. And I think the last 4 or 5 years have shown that, because you've had bipartisan opposition to bills that should have been passed. You've had bipartisan support for bills that should not have been passed. So I think that the term bipartisan now has lost a lot of the good flavor it used to put in people's mouths. It's because it's the uniparty now, where people, Mitch McConnell and Nancy, more in common than Mitch McConnell does with the average Republican in Kentucky. And that's the state of politics in America now.
Yeah, I mean, and a good analogy for this would be like if a husband and a wife owned a house and they were in some pretty serious debt that they have no real prospects of being able to repay, and the house has fallen into disrepair, and the wife is always saying, let's just spend the money to take care of this, and the husband saying, well, we really can't afford to do that. If they come together and agree to spend the money, but go further into this debt that's going to be a ball and chain around their neck, well, yes, the house is repaired. The house is now working better. Perhaps they can make some more money out of a business that they're running out of the house because it is well taken care of. But the reality is that they've still added to that debt, and there's still no prospect of paying that debt.
Right. It's exactly like that, except for, let me make the analogy even a little bit more poignant. They are not in debt. They're putting their kids in debt.
That's a good point. The husband and wife, they're actually the grandparents, because they're going to be checking out soon, because look at the Senate. They're
exactly
all 1 foot in the grave, and
but still making financial decisions.
At an age where their kids might be taking their keys.
Well, we didn't take the keys soon enough before they got this 1.2 trillion out the door. But maybe we'll learn our lesson this time.
And I like to conclude here by going through the list of these 17 Republican backers, and I'll, of course, give the states. I'd assume that most of the people who are listening to this segment are living in the United States. If you hear your state called, give a quick Google, see when they're up for re-election, and have the memory of an elephant, because 6 years is a long time, which is why senators get to pull shit like this with some frequency. Roy Blunt coming out of Missouri, Richard Burr, North Carolina, Shelley Capito, West Virginia, Senator Cassidy, Louisiana, Susan Collins of Maine. Maybe we give her a little bit of a pass because she's hanging on to her seat by the skin of her teeth. So Collins, we give you a pass on this one. Kramer, North Dakota, Crapo, Indiana, Lindsey Graham, my home state here, South Carolina, forever to thee. Grassley, Indiana. How do you say Sean Hoven, North Dakota? I'm not quite sure on his last name. Maybe
I'm not sure either.
All right, well, thank you, Sean, from North Dakota. Mitch McConnell, our fearless leader in Kentucky. Lisa Murkowski, Arkansas. Rob Portman, Ohio. Jim Reach, Idaho. Romney from Utah. Tillis, North Carolina. And Todd Young from Indiana. Remember.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the states called are states that Republicans should be able to win, and they should be able to make these.
Well, we've won. We've won the seats.
Yeah,
we've had the election.
Well, no, I meant the more conservative side of the party should be able to have a good showing against these candidates in upcoming elections. Louisiana, North Carolina, Arkansas, West Virginia. Those are all states that the American First movement should be able to put some pressure on these people for.
And the question is, how do you do this? Well, the basic playbook is every state will have a Republican Party organization within the state. There is some mechanism for which control of that organization is voted on. Now, I don't know what the schedules look like throughout, but you need to look up in your state how the Republicans within your state organize themselves. And you need to see if there is any America First movement within your state to put people within leadership of the state party to advance candidates like this, because a strong primary opponent for a Rhino Republican senator it's not something that's going to materialize out of thin air that you can then just vote for on election day. This is something that needs to be fought for 6 years prior to that primary. And the step to do that is to figure out, okay, has my party already voted on the leadership for the next, they probably operate in 2-year cycles. Have they voted on that already? If they haven't, can you get involved before this upcoming vote and find like-minded people? If they have, keep this idea on the back burner. Maybe put something in your Outlook calendar for 2 years from now, or your Google Calendar, whatever you use, to remind you to investigate this again in a couple of years, to figure out how you can get involved at the party level to put people in place to put the infrastructure in place for candidates to run who won't do things with the state party that you as the average voter completely disagree with. I mean, and this is a basic playbook for political action, but it's something that's really opaque if you're just looking at the cable news, looking at news websites, and trying to figure out how to actually affect political change that you want. And I think it's purposely opaque because the party leadership doesn't actually want the common riffraff having too much control, because they are the kinds of people who profit from these kinds of deals, as is seen by the fact that 17 Republican senators voted for this.
Right. And I'm sure that most of them think that they'll be able to vote for this and then not face any political consequences for their vote, which they need to be shown. Otherwise, if we don't, then they'll continue to vote for bills and legislation that continue to harm the average American and the American way of life.
And this is something we can learn from the progressive left, the members of the squad and similar organizations. They are great at pressuring the left to move left. And while that results in many policy outcomes that I hate, the reality is that there's a lot that we can learn from them on an organizational level as to how to affect change within your own party.
Yes, they've been. The Republicans have basically been controlled opposition as the left has just basically pushed further and further to the left, and they've definitely been way more efficient and effective than any Republican politician I can think of in recent history. So we definitely have to kind of meet them on their terms and start to learn from their tactics that have been way more effective than anything the Republican Party has been doing for the last 50, 60 years. And if you want to affect change in your state party, a great way to do that is just get involved in your local Republican executive committee. Figure out who your area is going to be sending to this as a state committee woman or a state committeeman, and that's a great way to start getting your voices heard, because as you said, it's deliberately opaque. They don't want people to know how to affect change or to make their voices heard on a local or state level, which state level becomes federal level in about one cycle. So that's the best way to do it, is start local and go from there.
And maybe that means getting involved in the 2022 midterm elections. And you might have to work for somebody who you don't completely love, but it's vital that people who like us, people who are interested in making change, learn how politics actually operates. Because the Trump administration has taught us that you can't just go in completely blind and expect to actually facilitate change. You need to have an understanding of how campaigns operate. You need to have an understanding of how government operates once you actually have the reins of power. And you need to have an understanding of how state political organizations work in order to affect meaningful change. Because while Trump did many things while he was in office, there were many more things that he did not do. And clearly, this has been a repudiation of the idea that he has had lasting influence on the swamp.
100%.
Well, I think that while I could go on talking about this until the end of time, perhaps we should delay that until next week. If you've made it thus far in the conversation, of course, I would like to say thank you. I don't know that anyone will even make it to the end of this video. However, it's a good time to let anyone who has know that we intend to do this every week. The video will come out early in the week. Once we get a couple more of these under our belts and standardize our practices a little bit more, we will be able to finalize a time and date when this comes out each week. But please stay tuned to this. Please subscribe to the channel if you would like to see more of this. Please leave a like, leave a comment. Those really help boost this in the algorithm so that more like-minded people can watch these. I'm Dylan Nolan. Had the pleasure of being joined by Liam Ford. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you.